Start your day with It's the Business. Here's Phil Dobbie.
So isn't the disruption caused by COVID-19 a chance to change things? I mean, the government has been bailing us out, delaying payments, giving us tax holidays, increasing benefits. Now, as we're told, we're on the mend from COVID-19, is it also time to fix the tax system, which is going to have to change anyway?
There are very strong upward pressures over time on government spending. Indeed, I'm absolutely certain that unless something very dramatic happens to our politics, which is always possible, that we are going to have to raise public spending as a share of GDP quite significantly over the next 10 years, even more in the long run.
We'll devote almost all of today's podcast talking to Martin Wolf, chief economics commentator at the Financial Times, about the need for tax reform, but will we get it? Plus, it's game on between Australia and Facebook.
Facebook's actions were unnecessary. They were heavy-handed and they will damage its reputation here in Australia.
The social media platform has stopped Aussies from posting links to news websites, but it doesn't stop there. We'll give you the heads up on a story that we're going to cover in more detail tomorrow morning. It's Thursday, the 18th of February, 2021. Good morning.
And now, it's The Business, making sense of it all with Phil Dobbie.
Yes, Facebook has gone through with its threat to stop Australians posting links to news articles on Facebook, or for anyone, anywhere, posting links to news articles from Australian publishers, most of which, of course, are owned by Rupert Murdoch, but also the public broadcasters, the ABC and SBS. But it doesn't stop there. If you want to tell your friends what the weather is like in Dubbo, you can't even link to the Bureau of Meteorology website. Here's the Australian Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg.
Their decision to block Australians' access to government sites, be they about support through the pandemic, mental health, emergency services, the Bureau of Meteorology, were completely unrelated to the media code, which is yet to pass through the Senate.
And that media code is what this is all about. We did say a couple of weeks ago that there was a David and Goliath argument brewing in Australia. The Aussie government, of course, are the ones that are David in this battle. I mean, Goliath is certainly Facebook. We'll see if we can get Paul Wallbang back on the podcast tomorrow morning to look at the latest in this ensuing battle. It's not going to go away in a hurry. The battle would mean, crazily, the legislation would mean that Facebook would have to pay the news media every time someone links to them. If you want to share an article in the Sydney Morning Herald and you post it on your Facebook feed, Facebook would have to pay the Sydney Morning Herald for you having done that. That doesn't make a great deal of sense. There's no logic in this. So more on that tomorrow, hopefully. Now, earlier this week, Paul Kavanagh talked about the rising disconnect between government tax income and spending. This idea that we're going to balance the books anytime soon, he said, is surely fanciful. That was Paul's read. It's also the read of many others, with the government able to borrow right now, obviously at very low interest rates. And there's always a buyer for their debt. If there's not, then don't worry, because the Bank of England will scoop up the bonds and eventually they will be inflated away. Eventually. It could take a long time, of course. And in the meantime, we know the government is going to heap more debt onto that pile. So are we okay with that? Well, one of our listeners pointed me to an article in a 1946 edition of American Affairs, a quarterly journal, with an article by Beardsley Rummel, who was chair of the New York Fed at the time. It was titled, "Taxes for Revenue Are Obsolete," and it pointed to how borrowing saw governments through, not tax. He says tax is really there to stabilise the purchasing power of the dollar, to redistribute income, to subsidise various industries, and the bad tax, he said, was a tax on company profits. Now, maybe we'll come to that shortly. But in more recent times, well, the weekend before last, Martin Wolf, chief economics commentator at the FT, was writing about the need to reform the tax system. And it does seem like a good opportunity, doesn't it? Particularly if we assume that the focus should not just be on balancing the budget. Well, he's with us now. So, Martin, you wrote that we do need to get some of the revenue back, at least in the longer term. But you do agree with Beardsley Rummel back in 1946 that tax is not just about getting revenue to pay for the government to function. There are other factors to consider, like the distribution of wealth and the size of the money supply as well.
I agree fundamentally that tax is a macroeconomic policy tool, which is essentially what he was saying. The government is able to borrow easily. I'm not in favor of wholesale monetization, and I'm certainly not in favor of the government controlling the central bank. We've seen that too often in Latin America. And so it's probably quite a useful heuristic to think about revenue in relationship to government spending, because it bears so massively on the macroeconomy. It determines to such a, because the government's the biggest spender, what's going on in the macroeconomy. But it's certainly not a binding constraint. And revenue, government taxes, government spending has to be seen in a much broader context in terms of its impact on the whole economy, including macroeconomic balance.
But the Bank of England isn't exactly operating independently. It is operating hand in fist with the government at the moment, isn't it, really? I mean, it's been a coordinated a plan, really, through this crisis. Yes,
the question of what independence mean is sort of one of those how long is a piece of string questions. I've always thought it makes sense for the Bank of England or the central bank to cooperate closely with government, because monetary and fiscal policy have interactive effects. So if they don't discuss how those interactions work, they're likely to choose very suboptimal policies, both of them and together. That's unfortunate. The question to me is, who gets to decide when the money printing stops, or if you like? And my view is that the Bank of England is independent if it is allowed to decide that. At the moment, it has decided, in conjunction with the government, that we are, and they're absolutely right to have decided this, in an exceptional crisis. The exceptional crisis, like a war, requires exceptional measures, which include very close cooperation between the two, with the Bank of England buying an enormous number of bonds, which directly is designed to support the economy, but indirectly, of course, also supports government borrowing and makes it easier to manage the fiscal consequences of this crisis.
So they would turn off the printing press, so to speak, at the point where they feel monetary policy can step back in, because the whole reason, obviously, is that as all central banks have been saying, we've gone as far as we can. Anything else, that famous expression, pushing on a string. Anything else is just pushing on a string. We can't do anything with monetary policy. It's got to be fiscal. So when they change that, you're saying they should make the call on when we change direction on that.
I assume they will. There are actually alternatives, and some of them are still out there for discussion. Most of them, in fact, in my view, nearly all of them, with one exception, involve the central bank, as it were, directly funding specific forms of spending, the so-called helicopter money phenomenon. The Bank of England sends a check to everybody. Is that monetary policy? Is it fiscal policy? Well, people look at that in different ways. But conventionally unconventional policy, if you like, the sort of thing governments have done before, and in fact our government did with the Bank of England in the Second World War, they're sort of getting to the limit. But I presume they will, if they start seeing, and I think it's possible they will see it, but nobody knows, significant inflationary pressure if the economy turns out to bounce back once the vaccines are in place much more strongly than they expect. There's a huge pent-up demand, and they start seeing really strong signs of inflationary pressure, excess demand, that is to say. I would expect the Bank of England to change policy. The question is, would it be smooth or brutal?
Yeah. And do you think it's going to happen soon? Because obviously there's a lot of talk about inflationary pressure in the United States, but we've got high levels of unemployment. Can we have inflation if there's lots of people still out of work?
Well, the one thing that I have learned since I'm old enough, from the 70s, is that it's actually perfectly possible to have both. It depends on how dysfunctional the economy is and what's happening to expectations. Stagflation was real. Now, in that case, it also required a very large negative terms of trade shock in terms of the enormous increase in oil prices. So one of the things people are looking at is commodity prices. My own view is it is, one, uncertain, as these things always are, if I've learned anything. Two, it is probable that we will remain in the low inflation world for a significant period of time, so there is no urgency, but it is possible that that is being too optimistic. If the if the pessimists about the US are right, I suspect they're not, but I think they're more likely to be right than here, then there is going to be a significant inflationary rise in the US. That will almost certainly lead to a change in monetary policy in the US. And in my experience, what happens in the US always affects us very significantly in many complex ways. So at the moment, I'm moderately optimistic that we won't have a problem, but I'm not certain.
So it does buy us a bit of time then, doesn't it? Getting back to what we really want to talk about today, which is reforming tax, because, I mean, the government has been fighting a losing battle in trying to keep government debt down in relation to our GDP. Despite austerity over the last 10 years, they've failed to achieve that. So you seem to be saying in your article a little over a week ago that we should be trying to fix that. We should perhaps have higher taxes, but also the structure of taxes should change. There's a lot would say that, you know, higher taxes right now is the last thing we should be thinking about, because that is going to slow down any recovery.
Yes, my column was set in a really long-term framework. So it's really not about the next 2 or 3 years. I really don't know whether, and this relates to what we just discussed, whether the short term, by which I mean here about 2 or 3 years, macroeconomic picture will be reasonably stable, limited excess demand, limited inflationary pressure. But if that's the case, then I think monetary policy can do most of what is needed, because it's so loose, it can clearly be tightened without any great problem. If you look at the really long run, it's pretty clear, as I argued, that there are very strong upward pressures over time on government spending. Indeed, I'm absolutely certain that unless something very dramatic happens to our politics, which is always possible, that we are going to have to raise public spending as a share of GDP quite significantly over the next 10 years, even more in the long run. We will start from a very large structural fiscal deficit, in my view, because we will never recoup the losses of the crisis in terms of potential output, because we've lost investment. We will have damaged so-called human capital. That's just a depressing reality with crises. We never recovered from the financial crisis. That was partly bad policy, but not only. So I assume that revenue will be less than we expected and spending will continue to rise. And then we are talking about fiscal deficits of maybe, if we don't do anything, of possibly 6, 7, 8, 9% of GDP. I don't believe that's consistent with macroeconomic stability in any way. So at some point, there's going to have to be either the austerity, which I don't think they can get away with given aging and all the other demands, or they're going to have to raise taxes. And that's the core argument I was making.
And, you know, if we look at places like Norway is often given, isn't it, as the example, you know, and if you put us in comparison with Norway, we are a very low taxing country. Government revenue there is more than half of GDP, which means, you know, a lot more public services are paid for, childcare, free education. It sounds like utopia to many people. Norway, for others, you know, it's the closest you can get to a communist country in the West. You know, they've got lots of pretty fountains that are paid for. If you're unemployed, you get 64% of your previous income for up to 3 months, which sounds good philosophically. As a country, though, we are a long way from that, aren't we? That is a big shift in our attitude towards taxation and also the provision of public services.
Yes, it's surprisingly a very, very wide range of tax ratios across countries which essentially have very, very similar GDP per head. At the high end, you've got countries that basically the Nordic countries and France. France is actually, I think, the highest in the developed world, way over 50% of GDP. And at the low end, you have countries at about 30. So that's a massive divergence. And at the low end, you basically tend to have the English-speaking countries, particularly. Even lower, interestingly, are the rich Asians, places like South Korea. Switzerland is also rather low and obviously a pretty prosperous country. So there are deep, political choices to be made here. And the choices are about how you want to spend your national income, how much you want it to be spent by people privately, how much you want to have it spent or transferred by the state. I think these are essentially value choices societies make. And what is so interesting is that different societies have made these choices over the last, 60, 70 years or so, and they've ended up in rather different places, and they seem to be sort of stuck there. We've been sort of in this roughly our current ratio, the mid to upper 30s, since the 70s. And the same is true from the English-speaking countries, which are Ireland, Australia. They're all in the US, at the low end, all in the same place. So we have to make a decision, a social decision. I think that's a core of what we want to do with our state relative to our society. It's not a debate we've ever had in a clear and rational way.
Yeah, great time to start now. But the reason why it hasn't shifted, of course, is because of incrementalism. You know, it's difficult with the politics that every country faces to make big changes at any one time. But just at the more macro level, though, I mean, do we know whether high tax or low tax is better for the creation of wealth for an economy? It seems like, you know, we can pick and choose and argue either way, can't we?
I think the evidence that the economists have been able to put together is really not very clear. Some economists have done empirical work which suggests that there is a very modest negative relationship between the average tax ratio and GDP per head, prosperity. And I'm focusing on GDP. I'm not going to get into the happiness debate because that gets even more difficult. But if you focus on GDP per head, there's a mildly negative ratio. Other people come to the conclusion there really isn't one. It really does seem to me that if you've got the other things you need in a prosperous society, you know, you've got private businesses that are reasonably well-run, dynamic, you have a highly educated population, first-rate higher education institutions, a government that provides infrastructure, a first-rate legal system, very important, and so forth. You have all these things which are essential, clearly necessary conditions, low corruption, all these sorts of things, then really the tax ratio per se doesn't tell you much. And high tax societies are often, though not always, high trust societies. And there's a lot of evidence that a high trust society like Denmark, for example, just works very well because everybody trusts one another. And that's a good thing for an economy. So there's no simple relationship is the answer. But coming back to your point about, you know, transformation, the truth is transformations tend to follow war. If you look at the history of public spending and tax in the UK and all other countries, there was a huge jump after the First War and a huge jump after the Second World War. And since then, it's been sort of roughly stable. You need a breakdown, a colossal crisis to change things. At the moment, it doesn't look to me that either the financial crisis or, interestingly, this one is actually going to lead to such a transformation of politics. Yep. Not here anyway, but I may be wrong.
Well, you know, my mum has described what we've been going through. She said it's like a war without the bombs, you know, in that, in fact, you know, in many ways we've had our freedom taken away from us more than you did during the war. So it feels like, I mean, I've not been through a war, but it feels like a crisis which is making people think about things. I mean, if maybe the economic hit has been different, but the attitude for change, I think, is there, isn't it?
This is very difficult for me to judge, and I may be utterly wrong. When I look at the political debate we're getting in this country, what I'm seeing, which really puzzled me, is that the Johnson Conservative Party is sort of moving away pretty decisively from Thatcherism. It's sort of a more mixed economy sort of model, and Starmer represents pretty clearly a repudiation of Corbynism, McDonaldism. So we actually, strangely, when I look at these people and what they're talking about, I find it very strange. It's more like the 50s. It's quite unlike America. So in Britain, I'm wondering where this energy is going to come from. I do think there are some areas where there are very big changes coming. I mean, I think the focus on climate change is radically changed. There's certainly more willingness to have government intervene in the economy, get involved in promoting growth, the leveling up agenda. What this will mean, I don't know. There is that. But real transformation, say raising tax relative to GDP by, as I said, 6 or 7 percentage points of GDP, nobody dares to mention this. I may be wrong, but at the moment I think we remain, and partly because we're such old countries, I mean, just full of old people, but we seem remarkably conservative.
So most people would argue, though, that the tax code, it's over 6,000 pages. In Hong Kong, it's 350 pages. Those 6,000 pages have not, I don't know about you, have not spent a great deal of time in them, but I'd imagine that they are largely unreadable. Most people need an accountant to try and do their tax returns. Obviously, there's loads of caveats and workarounds that people with money can use good accountants to try and minimize their tax, whereas, everyone else can't do that. I mean, there's lots of things to say, can we just start again? I mean, that's a big ask, but can we whittle down 6,000 pages to 350 pages and make it simpler? So not only are we increasing the amount of tax, but we're also fixing some of those other things that Beardsley Rummel was talking about, in particular, the wealth divide.
Well, the answer must be conceptually we could. And once it's all bedded in, it's quite likely, well, not quite likely, in my view, we should. I mean, no rational human being would ever design our current tax code. I mean, everybody who's looked at it at all knows it's a conceptual and practical mess of the first order. There are obviously two huge problems here in changing it. First, every loophole characteristic of our current tax is treasured by somebody, and probably by a lot of somebodies, and changes will be resisted. There will be massive resistance to dramatic change in this system, and that's particularly true if the net effect of the change you want to impose is going to be to increase tax. It's much easier when you're going to reduce it. And the second, of course, is a transformation, which is what you're talking about, would just upset an enormous number of people's plans, and that will also create a lot of resistance. Even if net there are more winners than losers, the process of discussion, the uncertainty involved in it, would certainly generate lots of questions about where are we going? Is this really the beginning of an ongoing process of reform? And the final issue, of course, is reaching a consensus on what this new system should look like, because every new system has some problems, in fact, quite severe problems. There's been a long-standing debate among economists about what sort of tax system we should have, but even that isn't completely agreed. So that's why everything tends to be incremental. And the very complexity of the system makes it very, very difficult to make the shift because you're changing so much.
Well, we're building on top of what's been done before. That's the problem with incrementalism, isn't it?
That is always the case. But knocking down everything and starting anew, revolutionary moments, as I said earlier, this really would be a revolution, always creates a tremendous resistance. Certainly that won't happen with this government, but I don't get the sense even in the Corbyn era. I mean, nobody really on the left either is thinking of let's overhaul the whole system. They think, well, let's bolt on a wealth tax to everything else. So that's an incremental thing, quite a big and important credit. Perhaps go back to the sort of tax rates we had in the early 80s, higher tax rates on wealthy people. But actually going through the process of reforming the entire tax system and creating a new one, new laws, getting it through Parliament. Nobody wants to think about it.
Well, Norway, of course, has a wealth tax, 0.85% of assets you hold anywhere in the world over 1.5 million kroner, which is about £130,000. And much of that goes to the local municipalities. I mean, that's an incremental tax. But if we're doing what we said we don't want to do, which is just bolt on stuff, it's not a bad one to start with, is it?
I can see an argument for wealth tax. There are lots of questions in my mind about how exactly this would work in our case. What you do about resident foreigners. What you do about, which is, I think, likely to happen, about people emigrating, what you do about revaluation. And I would certainly start the wealth tax at a higher level than you indicate, because if you're going to start at that level, I mean, there were an enormous number of people be covered.
It seemed very low.
It does seem very low. Yeah. I mean, I personally have tended to think that the most important thing from a social justice point of view is to focus on inheritance. Our inheritance taxes, which I covered in that article, are a real mess. The rich don't pay. Basically, middle and upper middle class people pay. I think and that was part of our tax, actually, I think in the 70s, that was certainly under discussion then. There should be a tax on receipt of gifts, and there should be a lifetime allowance. And after that, it should be taxed at a pretty high rate. Because we're trying to prevent the emergence of a hereditary plutocracy. But I should say, even doing this, what I've described, would create immense upheavals where people will start saying, well, you're breaking up and destroying family businesses, because that's a large part of people's inheritance, family businesses. There are always complexities, but a low wealth tax, which basically gets at if you did that, you get rid of capital gains tax, in my view, which is a very bad tax. If you have wealth tax instead of a capital gains tax, you're essentially taxing unrealized gains, because the tax rises as the value of your assets rises, which seems to me to make a lot of sense. And then that encourages you to use your wealth better. More productively, because it's being taxed anyway, and of course the income on your wealth, particularly on that form of those parts of your assets which don't generate income, there's implicit income because of capital gains, but you can get it in this way. But even in this, obviously to do this, you'd have to include value of housing. So you would be introducing another tax on housing wealth. It would be very, very unpopular.
Yeah, but it's not a bad idea, though, is it? Not necessarily just housing, but a land tax. I think you talked about that in your article as well, because that is one tax that is hard to avoid, isn't it? I mean, if we actually said, well, we're going to reduce income tax, but we're going to increase tax on land, then that would, then we are taxing people who have large residential properties. We're also stopping people from using real estate as a safe haven for cash rather than somewhere to live. I mean, it does have that risk, doesn't it, of people not being able to stay in the family home after the income dries up. But, it's one of the oldest taxes there is, land tax.
I think land taxes are a wonderful idea. I've always been in favor of them for all the reasons you suggest. One of the other advantages, if you tax undeveloped land for which planning permission has been granted, you make it very expensive to create land banks. You encourage development. You will encourage more building of housing, which we clearly need in our country. You generate revenue for the local authorities. I think the the revenue from land taxes should go to local authorities, with which they can build the infrastructure needed to and pay for that education and all the other things they need to do. And the problem you raise that would drive people out of their family home, that doesn't need to be the case. You can easily capitalize the tax. We're not talking about an enormous tax, probably. So it will be paid on death and out of the estate when the house, the property is finally sold. The real difficulty with it is introducing it now. We should have had it 100 years ago when, interestingly, or more than 100 years, when, interestingly, of all people, Winston Churchill was very much in favor of it in the early 20th century. The problem with it now is we've allowed land prices, because we don't tax them, to rise so high, and there is so much mortgage debt associated with it, that you would impose a heavy tax on somebody when the net wealth in housing or in land is very, very low. And that would be fine for somebody like me who doesn't have any debt anymore because I'm relatively old. But for younger people, it's a very heavy tax when they actually don't have any wealth. So I've been thinking about. But
it would pull back property values, though, wouldn't it, as well, at the same time? So it would make housing more affordable.
Then that's the problem. So we've got all this mortgage debt, which is attached, which the banks depend on, which is attached to existing land prices. Now, suppose we had a high land tax, it depends on the level, and we therefore drive down wealth, the value of land significantly. We will push a very significant number of new people who've just bought into negative net worth, and we would undermine the solvency of our banks in the process. It's very difficult to introduce when we've allowed so much land price inflation over the last 120 years. But in principle, particularly on unbuilt sites, a moderate land tax, site value tax, could be a very significant contributor to the tax.
Well, it would set the direction, wouldn't it? It would say, well, okay, it's not all being applied now, but this is the direction of travel, and it would adjust property values. But if you did it over, say, a couple of decades, and so you arrived at a more sensible solution in 20 years' time, then you would, adjustments would take place.
Well, what I've been thinking is at least you could run the tax in such a way as to basically get rid of land price inflation. And that would be rather nice. So our aim would be, and we'll take a bit of trial and error, but the aim would be to ensure that land prices per se don't continue to inflate, because it's really land prices that are exploding that mostly explain house price inflation. It's not the cost of building a house has risen so much. So that would stabilize house prices, and people would start looking at houses as just a place to live in, not as your principal asset. Your great capital asset. I think that aim to sort of stabilize land prices by basically taking the incremental rental value, which is sort of the Ricardian notion, into public ownership, and that would provide. And that could allow you to lower other taxes, particular taxes on investment and taxes on enterprise and effort, lower income tax and corporation taxes, therefore. Now, that depends really on the level and how much money you would make, and all this is quite complicated. But I think in principle, Henry George's famous argument for taxing land more heavily, which is basically an argument for taxing rent more heavily, is a very sound one.
Good point to leave it on. We know Rishi Sunak is not going to introduce that the week after next, or anytime soon.
Under this government.
I suspect we will just be tinkering at the edges with the next budget. But Martin, I could talk to you all day, clearly, but we'll leave it there for now. Thanks for your time.
It's a pleasure. Bye.
Martin Wolf, Chief Economics Commentator at the FT. And that's it for today on It's the Business. We are obviously in the early stages of this podcast, so do subscribe on your favourite podcast platform, or go to itsthebusiness.co.uk or itsthe.business, whichever you prefer, where you can also leave a voice message. If you go to the contact section of the main menu, then you'll be able to leave a message which we can play in future editions of the podcast if you want to get your voice and your opinion across. And if you've enjoyed today's show, share it on social media. Even in Australia, you can share this on social media. Not much else you can share, but this you can. I'm Phil Dobby, back again tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
It's the Business with Phil Dobby. Listen online at itsthe.business or wherever good podcasts are found.